In the first lesson we examined the core of Franz Brentano's psychology, intentionality as the criterion of the mental, the tripartite classification of acts, and the break with the content psychology of Wundt and Titchener. But Brentano's thought did not stand still. In the final decades of his life, his philosophy underwent a profound evolution toward an increasingly uncompromising metaphysical realism. He developed an original theory of the continuum, and he expanded his system into ethics with his doctrine of correct emotions. This second lesson explores that intellectual maturity and the formidable legacy he left through his students, Husserl, Meinong, Stumpf, Ehrenfels, and others. The problem we address in this second lesson concerns the evolution of Brentano's thought. In his 1874 work, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, the intentional object was described as residing within consciousness, the so-called intentional inexistence. The object seen, remembered, or desired was, in some sense, inside the mental act that pointed to it. Yet in the following decades, Brentano thoroughly revised this position. The intentional object, he came to see, cannot be an immanent content of consciousness. If it were, external perception could never deliver knowledge of the real world. We see things, not our own representations of things. The object is transcendent. It lies outside the mind and is independent of the act that thinks it. This turn raises an uncomfortable question for psychology. If the object is transcendent and its study belongs to the natural sciences or to ontology, what remains for psychology? Brentano's answer is that psychology must focus on acts and on the way they refer to objects, not on the objects themselves. Psychology remains the science of the mental, but the mental no longer contains the world, it points to it. The mature Brentano has come down to us through a fragmentary but substantial corpus. 4 main works mark this period. In 1889, he published The Origin of the Knowledge of Right and Wrong, which sets out his ethical theory. Just as there are evident judgments that grasp truth, there are correct emotions that grasp value. The love of knowledge and the joy taken in beauty are not subjective preferences, they are emotional acts that can be objectively correct or incorrect. In 1907, the Investigations into the Psychology of the Senses appeared, developing his theory of the continuum. Brentano rejects the idea that space and time are composed of indivisible points. Every continuous magnitude is prior to its parts, and points do not exist as independent entities but only as abstract boundaries. In 1911, he reissued the core chapters of his 1874 work under the title The Classification of Psychical Phenomena, this time with significant corrections reflecting his realist turn. This is the definitive version of his act psychology. To these must be added the posthumous manuscripts on the continuum, space, and time, edited by his students Kraus and Kastel. The correspondence with Husserl, Stumpf, and Marti provides an invaluable window into the evolution of his thinking and the strains emerging among his followers. Brentano's mature years unfolded in progressive academic isolation. After leaving Vienna definitively in 1895, he settled in Florence, where he would remain for nearly 2 decades. Without a chair, without regular students, without institutional backing, his influence operated through indirect channels. A vast correspondence and the mediation of former students who now held prominent positions in Germany and Austria. This was also a period of ruptures. Husserl, his most brilliant pupil, distanced himself step by step. In his Logical Investigations of 1900, Husserl criticized the residual psychologism of Brentano's early psychology. Although Brentano partly shared that critique, he could not accept the transcendental turn Husserl was giving to phenomenology. Meinong, for his part, was developing a theory of objects in grots that granted ontological status to entities such as non-existent or impossible objects. Brentano, increasingly realist, saw this as a relapse into the very immanentism he himself had abandoned. The influences of this phase shift toward British empiricism. Locke and Mill become constant interlocutors. Brentano's realism hardened. Only individual things, substances, exist. Abstractions, universals, merely intentional objects are not entities but manners of speaking. Aristotle remained the ultimate anchor. The ontology of categories and the primacy of individual substance structure his entire mature thought. The mature thought of Franz Brentano rests on three pillars that extend and correct his original system. The first pillar is metaphysical realism. In his 1874 work, Brentano had described intentionality using the scholastic concept of intentional inexistence. The object thought is somehow in the act that thinks it. This formulation, however, was vulnerable to an immanentist reading, according to which the object would be an internal content of consciousness. In his later work, Brentano explicitly rejects that interpretation. In a letter to Oskar Kraus of 1909, he puts it with total clarity. It is not consciousness that is the object. Rather, the object is the object of consciousness. The sentence completely inverts the perspective of 1874. The intentional object is transcendent. When we see a tree, we do not see our representation of the tree, we see the tree itself. External perception puts us in direct contact with reality. To conflate the act of thinking with the content thought is a categorical mistake with serious consequences. The second pillar is the theory of the continuum. Brentano argues that space and time are not made up of indivisible points, as the Pythagoreans or atomists held. A point is not a part of the continuum, it is an abstract boundary that exists only as a frontier between regions. Continuous magnitude is prior to its parts. It is not built by adding points, just as a line is not composed of extensionless positions. This theory has direct implications for perceptual psychology. What we perceive phenomenally is not discrete units we then assemble, but continuous wholes we only later decompose analytically through abstraction. Stumpf and Ehrenfels would take this idea and turn it into the cornerstone of Gestalt psychology. The third pillar is the ethics of correct emotions. In The Origin of the Knowledge of Right and Wrong of 1889, Brentano extends his analysis of psychical acts into the domain of value. Just as there are evident judgments that grasp truth immediately, like the principle of non-contradiction, there are correct emotions that grasp objective values. The love of knowledge, the joy taken in beauty, the repulsion at unjust suffering are not mere subjective reactions. They are emotional acts that can be correct or incorrect. Brentano condenses this into a precise formulation. We call something good when the love directed upon it is correct. Ethics is not a matter of externally imposed norms but of an educated emotional sensitivity that apprehends value in the world. The three pillars of mature Brentano are not dogmatic assertions. Each rests on arguments that deserve separate examination. The first argument targets the immanentism of his own early phase. If the intentional object were an internal content of consciousness, external perception could never yield knowledge of the real world. We would see our own representations, not things themselves. But phenomenal experience says otherwise. When we perceive a tree, we distinguish effortlessly between the act of perceiving and the tree standing out there. They are not the same thing. The act is mine, private, temporal. The tree is public, independent, accessible to other observers. Brentano concludes that the intentional object is transcendent. Psychology must study the act and its mode of reference, but the object itself falls to the natural sciences or to ontology. The second argument challenges the atomistic conception of space and time. Suppose a line were composed of indivisible points. Between any two points there would always be infinitely many more, because between any two positions there is always an intermediate position. Yet adding infinitely many extensionless points never yields anything extended. It is mathematically impossible. Moreover, what we perceive is not points. We see continuous surfaces, we hear sounds that stretch and linger, we feel time as a flow. The continuum is an irreducible phenomenal datum. Points, instants, boundaries are not real parts of the continuum, they are abstractions the understanding introduces when it analyzes it. The third argument establishes the analogy between judgment and emotion. Some judgments impose themselves with immediate evidence. We need no proof for the principle of non-contradiction, we simply see that it is true. Its denial is not false but unintelligible. Brentano holds that something analogous occurs in the emotional domain. Some loves and hatreds impose themselves with immediate correctness, loving knowledge, rejoicing in beauty, recoiling from unjustly inflicted suffering. Whoever fails to experience this correctness is emotionally blind, just as whoever denies the principle of non-contradiction fails to grasp logic. Ethics, therefore, is not founded on commands or social conventions but on an emotional experience analogous to judicative evidence. Its foundation is as firm as that of logic itself. The implications of Brentano's mature thought overflow the boundaries of psychology and extend into ontology, ethics, and the history of the school he founded. The first implication is the transformation of act psychology into an ontology of the object. If the intentional object is transcendent, then psychology cannot study it directly. Its task is to analyze acts and their modes of reference, but the being of objects belongs to another discipline, ontology. The mature Brentano becomes an ontologist who defends the primacy of individual substance. Only concrete things exist. Abstractions, universals, merely intentional objects are not entities but manners of speaking. This distinction among act, content, and object would be systematized by his student Twardowski and become a cornerstone of the Lwow Warsaw School. The second implication connects the continuum theory to the birth of Gestalt psychology. Carl Stumpf, a direct student of Brentano, applied the continuum theory to the study of acoustic and musical perception. His student Christian von Ehrenfels published the founding article of Gestalt theory in 1890, showing that a melody is more than the sum of its notes. It possesses an irreducible formal quality. That idea derives directly from Brentano. The perceptual whole is prior to its parts, and perception does not assemble sensory atoms but grasps continuous wholes. The Gestalt school, Wertheimer, Kohler, Kafka, has one of its deepest roots here. The third implication projects onto ethics. Max Scheler and Dietrich von Hildebrand, trained in the Brentanian circle, developed the ethics of correct emotions into a far-reaching phenomenological axiology. Values, according to Scheler, are grasped through intentional emotional acts: love, hatred, preference. They are not deduced rationally, yet they are objective and hierarchically ordered. There are sensory, vital, spiritual, and religious values. This entire axiological architecture has its starting point in Brentano's simple yet revolutionary thesis: correct love stands to value as evident judgment stands to truth. The fourth implication is the fragmentation of the school. Far from forming a monolithic block, Brentano's students developed philosophical programs that were highly diverse and often mutually incompatible. Husserl took intentionality toward transcendental phenomenology, breaking with his teacher's realism. Meinong built a theory of objects that granted ontological status to entities like the round square, which Brentano regarded as a relapse into immanentism. Twardowski, more faithful, systematized the act-content-object distinction and founded a school of logic and analytic philosophy in Lwow. The paradox is that this fragmentation was also the proof of Brentano's fertility. His ideas were rich enough to inspire opposing traditions. Brentano's mature thought resolves some tensions from his early phase, but it opens new ones that remain matters of active debate. 4 questions stand out for their importance and their continuing relevance. The first concerns the compatibility of mature realism with descriptive psychology. In 1874, Brentano had founded act psychology on a neutral description of psychical phenomena, without committing to the real existence of intentional objects. It sufficed to note that every act is directed toward something. Yet in his later work, Brentano insists that this something is transcendent and real. The question is unavoidable: does this assertion compromise the methodological neutrality that defined descriptive psychology? If psychology must pronounce on the existence of objects, it encroaches on ontology. But if it refrains, then realism becomes a personal conviction of Brentano's rather than a scientific thesis. The second problem targets the ethics of correct emotions. The analogy with evident judgment is brilliant but fragile. When two people disagree about the principle of non-contradiction, there is no room for debate. One of them simply fails to understand logic. Yet in the moral domain, disagreements are ubiquitous and persistent. Two people may claim, in complete honesty, to experience opposing correct emotions in response to the same fact. How do we adjudicate the conflict? If we appeal again to emotional evidence, we beg the question. If we seek an external criterion, then emotional correctness is no longer analogous to logical evidence, for logic requires no external criteria. The charge of intuitionism, of grounding ethics in a mysterious and unverifiable faculty, has shadowed this theory since its inception. The third problem concerns the disciplinary status of the continuum theory. Brentano presents it as a contribution to perceptual psychology, and so it is. We perceive continua, not points. Yet his arguments against the atomistic composition of space and time are, strictly speaking, mathematical arguments that bear on set theory and the nature of infinity. Was Brentano doing experimental psychology, philosophy of mathematics, or both at once? The ambiguity has complicated the reception of this part of his work, which some regard as a dispensable technical appendix and others as one of his most original contributions. The fourth problem is the role left to introspection after the realist turn. Inner perception, which in 1874 had been the privileged source of psychological knowledge, seems to lose part of its scope. If the intentional object is transcendent, the introspective gaze can capture only the act and its mode of reference, not the object itself. Knowing the world is no longer a matter of peering into one's own consciousness but of opening oneself to what lies outside. Does introspection then remain a reliable method, or has it been reduced to an auxiliary procedure? The debate over the mature Brentano has been shaped by interpreters who have focused precisely on the three pillars we have examined: realism, the continuum, and ethics. The first great defender of the unity of Brentano's thought was Oskar Kraus, a direct student and the editor of his posthumous works. Kraus rejected the image of two opposed Brentanos, the immanentist psychologist of 1874 and the realist metaphysician of the later years. For Kraus, intentional inexistence had always been a provisional formula, a piece of scholastic scaffolding Brentano discarded as soon as he found a more precise expression for his thought. The realist turn was not a rupture but the logical culmination of a system that from the outset sought to anchor psychology in an ontology of the real. Where others see two distinct philosophers, Kraus sees one, faithful to himself across decades of relentless revision. The theory of the continuum has found in Dale Jacquet one of its most rigorous analysts. Jacquet examined Brentano's arguments against point atomism from the perspective of the philosophy of mathematics and contemporary mereology. His conclusion is that the Brentanian critique remains pertinent. The attempt to construct continuous magnitudes from extensionless points encounters difficulties that set theory has not entirely dissolved. Jacquet argues that the Brentanian continuum is no technical curiosity tucked away in the margins of his psychology but an original contribution that anticipates current debates on supervenience, emergence, and the relation between wholes and parts. Far from being a museum piece, the continuum theory deserves to be discussed within 21st-century formal ontology. In the ethical domain, Linda McAllister has been the foremost defender of the theory of correct emotions against the charge of intuitionism. McAllister contends that Brentano appeals to no mysterious faculty, no ineffable intuition. What he describes is a kind of emotional experience that bears a strict analogy to judicative evidence. Just as certain judgments impose themselves upon us as evident without our being able to prove them, and without that making them infallible, certain emotions impose themselves as correct without our needing to deduce them from prior principles. But emotional correctness, McAllister insists, is fallible. We can educate it, refine it, subject it to criticism. It is not a blind instinct but a sensitivity that is cultivated. Brentanian ethics would thus be a form of emotional cognitivism. Emotions are not irrational impulses but acts that can be correct or incorrect, and that give us access to a domain of values as objective as that of logical truths. We have reached the end of our examination of Franz Brentano's mature thought. 3 points deserve to be taken away. First, the evolution toward realism. The Brentano of 1874 described intentionality as a relation to an object immanent to consciousness. The mature Brentano corrected that position: the intentional object is transcendent. We do not see our representations, we see things. This turn transforms act psychology into an ontology of the real. For the late Brentano, only individual substances exist. Abstractions, universals, merely thought objects are not entities but manners of speaking. Second, the continuum theory and the ethics of correct emotions. The continuum is not built from points, just as a melody is not the sum of its notes. This idea, transmitted through Stumpf and Ehrenfels, lies at the root of Gestalt psychology. In the ethical domain, Brentano showed that emotions can be correct or incorrect, just as judgments can be true or false. Ethics requires no external commands. It is grounded in an educated emotional sensitivity that apprehends objective values. Third, the fragmented but ubiquitous legacy. The Brentano school did not survive as a unified block. Husserl took intentionality toward transcendental phenomenology. Menon built a theory of objects Brentano would have rejected. Twardowski founded the Lvov Warsaw School. Yet that very fragmentation is the proof of his thought's fertility. Few philosophers have left so deep an imprint on such diverse traditions. The mental act does not contain the world, it points to it. And in that gesture both psychology and ontology are founded. For those wishing to pursue the mature Brentano further, the essential starting points begin with his own works. The Origin of the Knowledge of Right and Wrong of 1889 sets out the ethics of correct emotions. The Investigations into the Psychology of the Senses of 1907 develops the continuum theory. The Classification of Psychical Phenomena of 1911 offers the definitive version of his act psychology, incorporating the realist corrections. As for scholarship, the Cambridge Companion to Brentano, edited by Dale Jacquet in 2004, brings together essays covering every phase of his thought and serves as an excellent overview. Linda McAllister, in The Development of Franz Brentano's Ethics of 1982, provides the most complete defense of the theory of correct emotions against the intuitionist critique. Dale Jacquet, in his essay on the continuum theory included in the same Cambridge Companion, analyzes this facet from the standpoint of the philosophy of mathematics and contemporary mereology. In the next lesson we shall begin our study of one of Brentano's most original and controversial students, Alexius Meinong. We shall focus on his theory of objects, his classification of the various types of entities, existent, subsistent, ideal, and the break this proposal represented with his teacher's realism. We hope you join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.